I had always loved the idea of camping, by myself far away from the crowds and the everyday commotion of city life, the concept of waking up to the rustling of leaves instead of an alarm clock and taking in the scent of pine rather than exhaust fumes had a certain romantic charm. After mulling it over for weeks, I finally planned a trip to Rondak Park in upstate New York. I figured early June would be perfect, mild weather, fewer mosquitoes than midsummer and fewer tourists than peak season in July. I spent the week before my trip gathering gear. I visited an outdoor shop in Albany, where I lived then, and bought a sturdy new sleeping bag rated for cooler nights. My old tent had rips along the seams, so I replaced it with a small lightweight model designed for backpacking. I ensured I had enough freeze-dried meals, trail mix, and protein bars. On Thursday evening, I loaded everything into my old Honda Civic trunk and planned to head north the next morning. I set out at sunrise on Friday, driving along Interstate 87, passing signs for Saratoga Springs, Lake George, and eventually the turnoff for the High Peaks region. The sky was a brilliant blue, dotted with only a few puffy clouds, and my anticipation grew with each mile. After about 2.5 hours, I left the highway way and ventured onto the smaller roads that wound deeper into the Adirondack Mountains. I passed through the picturesque town of Keene with its mom and pop shops and cafes. The mountains rose majestically in the distance, their slopes covered in dense evergreens and deciduous trees just beginning to show bright green leaves. Around midday, I arrived at the trailhead parking lot near the Mount Marcy area. The sign read Adara High Peaks Wilderness, and there were a handful of other cars in the lot, but not so many that it felt crowded. I hoisted my backpack onto my shoulders, feeling the weight of all my supplies, and began my hike. I planned to follow a lesser-known trail that branched off from the main route leading to Marcy Dam, eventually finding a secluded spot to set up camp. The day was warm and sunlight filtered through the canopy overhead, illuminating ferns and mossy logs on the forest floor. I breathed in the fresh scent of pine needles and damp earth, feeling a profound sense of peace. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of small woodland creatures, chipmunks darting across the trail or squirrels scurrying up tree trunks. Every once in a while, I heard woodpeckers hammering in the distance. This was exactly the solitude and immersion in nature I had been craving. After a couple of hours, I found a small clearing by a winding creek. The spot was idyllic, soft ground, flat enough for a tent and close to a water source. I decided it would be perfect for my campsite. I sat down my pack and took a moment to enjoy the gentle sound of flowing water. A light breeze carried the scent of spruce. It felt far from any roads or parking lots, just the sort of isolation I had hoped for. I pitched my new tent, pleased by how quickly it went up. Then I gathered some dry firewood, careful to adhere to the park's guidelines, only using dead and downed wood, making a small fire ring with rocks so as not to scar the area. By late afternoon, the sun was beginning its slow descent behind the trees. Long shadows stretched across the forest floor, and the temperature dipped slightly. I cooked one of my freeze-dried meals, a simple pasta dish that tasted surprisingly good in the fresh mountain air. By the time I finished my dinner, dusk had settled, and I felt the familiar calm of night in the wilderness. I built a small campfire to chase away any lingering chill, then unrolled my sleeping bag inside the tent. Sitting by the crackling flames, I watched stars appear overhead. The Adara, far from city lights, offered a gorgeous view of the Milky Way, something I rarely saw back in Albany. A soft hoot of an owl punctuated the stillness. The darkness felt comforting, at least initially, but as the evening wore on, an uneasy feeling crept over me. Perhaps it was just the awareness that I was alone out here, more exposed than I'd ever been. I tried to reassure myself that many people camp solo, and the wildlife in this part of the Adara. Generally avoid humans. I shook off my nerves and reminded myself that this was exactly the adventure I had wanted at. Around 11 o'clock I was lying on my back, gazing up at the star-filled sky through a gap in the canopy when I heard a soft rustling in the nearby undergrowth. My first thought was that it might be a raccoon or a fox sniffing around. I sat up, heart pounding a little too hard, and grabbed my flashlight. I swept the beam across the bushes, catching only the glint of leaves. No telltale reflection of eyes, convinced it was likely just a passing animal. I tried to settle back down, but the rustling persisted, growing louder, and it started to move in a slow, deliberate way that didn't feel random. I sat up again, an uneasy knot forming in my stomach. Shining the flashlight into the darkness, I could see the outlines of tall pines and the occasional flicker of a branch in the breeze, but nothing else. My campfire had dwindled to embers, offering little illumination. After a minute of straining my ears, the sound stopped. I convinced myself to lie back down, though my pulse was racing. Sleep was elusive. I drifted in and out, each forest noise magnified by my imagination. Around midnight I heard something that sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. Footsteps. These were not random scurries of a small animal. It sounded like a person walking, each step pressing leaves and twigs underfoot with care, as if trying not to be heard. My breath caught in my throat. I forced myself to sit up and call out, "Hello, who's there?" My voice wavered. The footsteps stopped abruptly. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribcage, waiting for a response. None came. The silence that followed felt even more unnerving than the footsteps themselves. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag, snatched a small hatchet I'd brought for chopping wood, and unzipped the tent. The cold night air washed over me as I stepped out. My flashlight trembled in my grip as I aimed it into the trees. At first I saw nothing but layered shadows, then a shape caught my eye, tall, human-like, lingering near the tree line. I couldn't make out a face or clothing details, but my instincts screamed that someone was there watching me. "What do you want?" I shouted, trying to project strength. I didn't feel the figure, didn't move. It stood there silent as a statue. Then, as if a decision was made, it advanced a few steps. My heart leaped into my throat without a second thought. I dropped my flashlight and bolted into the woods. Branches whipped my arms and scratched my cheeks. In my panic I forgot my sense of direction. I only knew I had to get away from the figure behind me. After running for what felt like an eternity, though it was likely only a few minutes, I saw a faint glow through the trees. My relief was immediate and immense. A small cabin with lit windows stood at the edge of a larger clearing. I dashed toward it, half stumbling, and pounded on the door. My voice came out in a ragged cry, "Please help me, someone's out here." The door opened to reveal an older man, perhaps in his 70s, wearing a flannel shirt and well-worn jeans. His eyes went wide at the sight of my frantic state, and he waved me inside without hesitation. "What on earth's the matter?" he asked in a gruff but concerned tone. "There's someone out there," I gasped. Leaning against the wall, he was following me. The man peered out the window, switching off the interior light so he could see better into the darkness. "I don't see anyone," he murmured, "but I'll lock the door." He threw a bolt across the door and drew the curtain. I noticed a hunting rifle propped in a corner. "You injured?" he asked, looking me over. I shook my head, though my ankle throbbed from tripping over roots in my flight. The man brought me a glass of water, and I thanked him, my shaking hands splashing a bit of it onto the floor. He let me crash on a threadbare couch in the front room. Sleep came in restless increments, my mind haunted by the faceless figure in the woods. When the pale light of dawn finally arrived, the man offered to walk me back to my campsite to pack up. I hesitated, still jittery, but I knew I needed my gear. We both stepped outside, scanning the tree line. There were only birds greeting the morning, their song carrying through the crisp air we found. My campsite undisturbed, no footprints, no sign of the intruder, nothing out of place except for my scattered belongings, where I dropped them in haste. Still, the memory of that silhouette lurking beyond my campfire's glow was enough to convince me that my solo adventure had gone on long enough. I gathered my supplies, stuffed them into my pack, and thanked the man for his help. He simply nodded. "You be careful out here," he said quietly. "It's a big park and not everyone you meet is friendly." On the hike back to my car, every crackle of a branch under my boots and every rustle of leaves in the breeze made me jump, though I didn't see another soul. The entire tray, I couldn't escape the prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as though I were still being watched. When I finally reached the parking lot, relief washed over me. I tossed my backpack into the trunk and slid into the driver's seat, shutting the door with a DCI of slam. As I turned the key in the ignition, I vowed to stick to more populated camping spots from then on, or maybe just invite a friend next time. My desire for solitude had led me to discover a much darker side of the wilderness than I had ever expected. Before we dive into the next story, if you're visiting our channel for the first time, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell icon to stay updated with our upcoming scary stories. My name is Alex Moreno, and I work the overnight shift at a small worn-down hotel called the Moonlight Inn, situated on the outskirts of Charleston, South Carolina. Our establishment sits just off Highway 17, a short drive away from the city's bustling heart. During the day, it's an unremarkable place with a faded neon sign and a modest parking lot that never seems quite full, but this old building takes on an almost foreboding presence at night, especially during a coastal storm. I'd clocked in that evening at 10 o'clock sharp, as I always do. Outside, thick clouds gathered and the forecast warned of torrential rain plus occasional thunder. The day staff looked relieved to hand off the shift as they bolted for home, hoping to beat the worst of the weather. After a quick rundown of the guest list, only 3 rooms occupied that night, and a glance at the daily log, I settled onto the tall stool behind the reception desk and began my usual routine, scanning the security monitors, listening for the phone, and doing my best to stay awake. By 11, the storm had rolled in with full force. The wind hammered against the eaves and the rain battered the windows so relentlessly it almost sounded like someone knocking. From my vantage point behind the scarred wooden front desk, I could see flashes of lightning reflect off the parking lot's puddles. A dull hum of electricity reverberated through the building each time lightning split the sky, followed by a low rumble of thunder. I've always found the night shift to be a strange blend of monotony and tension. 90% of the time nothing happens. The other 10% can feel like a whole different world. This was one of those nights that felt charged, like the storm had electrified the air and made every small noise impossible to ignore. The second hand of the old wall clock above me seemed louder, each tick echoing in the lobby. The potted fern by the door swayed with each gust that managed to sneak inside through gaps in the old frame. Sometime near midnight, I heard the front entrance rattle. My body stiffened. Sure enough, the door creaked open. A man stepped in, rain soaked from head to toe. Water streamed off his wide-brimmed hat and the shoulders of his dark overcoat, forming a small puddle around his feet. The overhead light in the lobby flickered momentarily, probably a surge caused by the storm, but it also made it harder for me to get a clear look at his face. Even so, I could see that his eyes were keen, almost piercing, as they focused on me. "Good evening," I said, forcing a professional smile. "Welcome to the Moonlight Inn. How can I help you tonight?" "Need a room," he replied, his voice low and raspy, like he'd either been shouting recently or maybe had a bad cough. He said, a worn leather wallet on the desk. His words were brief, but they carried an intensity that made my stomach flutter with unease. Can all right, I answered, let's see what we've got available. I opened our booking software and noted we had several vacancies. This was no surprise given the weather and our out of the way location. We can offer you room 13 on the ground floor. Recently had some renovations done. I lied though. I hoped the thread be carpet and chipped wallpaper might not be too off-putting. He slid his driver's license across the counter without waiting for me to ask. This motion was just slightly off, too rigid, too mechanical. I glanced at it. Jack Harrison, with an address in Columbia, about 2 hours northwest of Charleston. Not suspicious on its own, but something about him felt off. I typed his information into our system, my fingers trembling slightly on the keyboard. All right, Mr. Harrison, I said, handing him a key card. Room 13 is just down the left hallway. Checkout is at 11 o'clock in the morning, but if you need anything through the night, just pick up your phone or come see me at the front desk. He gave a curt nod. Thanks, he said, voice still rough, and he disappeared down the dim corridor. The overhead lights in the hallway buzzed as they swung on their chains, rattled by the draft that blew in through a small window at the end of the hall. Within seconds, the man was gone from sight, but a feeling of unease lingered. I tried to refocus on my routine tasks, checking tomorrow's reservations, confirming wake-up calls for the three other guests, and flipping through the night's housekeeping notes. Yet my mind kept drifting back to that name, Jack Harrison. It felt oddly familiar. I'd heard it before, but I couldn't place where. The tension in my gut wouldn't subside, so I decided to do a quick online search. Maybe I'd seen that name in local headlines or on a true crime blog. The storm outside provided a steady soundtrack of hammering rain and distant thunder. As I opened my browser, the results came up more quickly than I expected. There it was, an article dated 3 years prior from the state newspaper out of Columbia. Jack Harrison still at large. The headline read, my heart rate spiked. The piece described a man wanted for violent crimes, specifically armed robbery and aggravated assault. According to the article, he had vanished after a string of incidents across central South Carolina. The photograph attached to the story showed a man with intense eyes, a strong jaw, and a slight scar on his left cheek. That face looked all too similar to the man who had just checked in. Immediately I felt adrenaline surge through my system. My rational mind told me I needed to call the police, so I did. My hand shook as I dialed 911 on the lobby phone, trying to keep my voice even. The dispatcher asked for details, location, subject, description, and reason for concern. As calmly as I could, I explained that a man who matched the description of a wanted criminal from a past news story had just checked into the Moonlight Inn. I provided the address and told them he was in room 13. The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way. Hanging up the phone, I found myself glancing at the security feeds. We have a small monitor that cycles through 4 different camera views: the front desk, the rear exit, the parking lot, and the first floor hallway. The feed for the hallway showed no sign of movement. Room 13's door was closed, the corridor was empty, and the only flicker came from the old overhead fixture. Rain pummeled the roof and thunder boomed nearby. Minutes dragged. Every tick of the clock felt elongated by tension. Finally, through the haze of the storm, I saw blue and red lights flashing across the parking lot pavement. The police had arrived. 2 officers, wearing dark raincoats and carrying flashlights, stepped through the front door in a rush of wind and water. Where is he? Asked the taller officer, his tone clipped and professional. I pointed down the left hallway. Room 13 registered as Jack Harrison. He just arrived about 15 minutes ago. The 2 officers exchanged glances. Stay here, the taller one said to me. They moved swiftly, walking side by side down the corridor. The shorter officer rapped on room 13's door. Mr. Harrison, this is the Charleston Police Department. We need you to open the door. No answer. The taller officer knocked. Harder, Mr. Harrison, open up now. Silence. The shorter officer motioned for me to come closer, so I inched down the hall, my pulse pounding in my ears. He asked if I had a master key. My stomach clenched, but I fished the spare key card out of my pocket when he unlocked the door and pushed it open. One of them aimed his flashlight into the darkness. The room was empty. No clothing on the chair, no suitcase by the bed, and no personal items left on the bathroom sink. The bedspread was undisturbed, not even a single wrinkle. The small window on the opposite side of the room was wide open, the curtain whipping in the wind, letting in a spray of rain that had soaked the carpet. The officers walked in, checking the bathroom and the closet. Nothing. Jack Harrison was gone. I stood in the doorway, breathing hard. I don't understand, I stammered. He went straight from the lobby to he. I didn't see him leave. One of the officers set his hands on his hips. He might have climbed out the window if he headed for the woods behind the hotel. The storm could cover any tracks. The taller officer nodded. We'll do a quick perimeter check, but with this rain it'll be tough to find footprints or anything useful. Don't blame yourself. The man knew what he was doing. As they left to search the grounds, I remained in that vacant room, staring at the open window and the puddle spreading across the floor. My mind raced with questions. Why check into a hotel for 15 minutes, only to vanish immediately afterward? Had he realized I might call the cops once I recognized him? Within half an hour, the officers returned, dripping wet, shaking their heads. They hadn't found anyone in the immediate area. They told me to contact them if I saw Jack Harrison again, or if anything else suspicious occurred before they left. The shorter officer handed me his card. If you remember anything else, anything at all, give me a ring. I nodded, heart still thumping, and followed them back to the lobby. After they drove off, the moonlight in felt impossibly quiet. The storm raged on outside, but inside every corridor seemed deserted. Every light too dim. Dawn crept up eventually, the rain easing into a gentle drizzle. When the morning clerk arrived, I recounted the whole ordeal, from the storm to the frantic call to the police. We checked our security footage, but all it showed was Jack Harrison walking down the hallway, never returning. The feed for the exterior cameras was blurred by sheets of rain. We couldn't see how he exited or where he went. To this day, I have no idea if he's still out there. Sometimes I wonder if he had been watching me closely, testing my reactions the moment he signed in. Maybe he'd planned to flee through that window from the start, intending never to spend more than a few minutes in that room. All I know is that I'll never forget that dark, stormy night at the moonlight in just off Highway 17, see his name in that old news article, and realizing who he was. That's the kind of thing that puts a chill in your bones. I'm Gavin, and I've lived in the suburbs of Detroit all my life. Growing up, I heard countless tales about the abandoned factories scattered around the city, once booming auto plants that fell silent as industries shifted and jobs moved elsewhere. People would say these places were haunted, or that they housed secret labs hidden from public view. My three closest friends, Tristan, Bobby, and Sarah, and I never truly believed in ghosts or anything supernatural, but we'd always been curious about the remnants of our city's past. It was a chilly Sunday evening in late October, right when the leaves on the maples had turned bright shades of orange and red. The four of us were hanging out at Bobby's place, working our way through a stack of pizza boxes, when Tristan pitched an idea. Let's go explore the old Riverdale assembly plant, he said, wiping grease off his chin. I've heard it's easy to get in if you go around the back. Bobby and Sarah traded looks, and I felt a jolt of excitement mixed with a flicker of uncertainty. We'd all heard about Riverdale Assembly. It was built in the 1920s and had shut down decades ago, leaving behind a massive hulking structure that loomed beside the Detroit River. Windows had been smashed, metal beams were rusting, and rumor had it that A few people, either urban explorers or local squatters, still ventured inside. Every so often, despite my nerves, the idea was too tempting to pass up. We piled into Tristan's old Honda around 9 o'clock that night, just as a brisk wind began picking up the drive took us down Jefferson Avenue, past boarded up buildings, the occasional newer development, and a few convenience stores that never seemed to close. Street lights flickered as we pulled on to an unmarked side road leading to the abandoned plant. By the time we parked, my stomach was twisting with anticipation. We hopped out onto cracked pavement littered with scraps of metal and broken glass. A chain link fence surrounded the perimeter of the old factory, but we found a gap near the corner where the fence had sagged. Tristan held it open, and one by one we slipped through up close. Riverdale Assembly was even more imposing than I'd imagined. 5 stories of cracked concrete and shattered windows stared down at us in the gloom. I could make out old signage and enormous rusted metal are that once welcomed workers through the main entrance. The wind funneled through open doorways, whistling through the hollow corridors within. I tugged my hoodie tighter and clicked on my flashlight. We made our way to a side entrance where the heavy steel door had long since been pried open. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop a few degrees. Dust swirled in the cone of my flashlight. I could hear the crunch of debris underfoot, each step echoing through the cavernous space. Tristan, always the most adventurous, took the lead. He shone his flashlight around what used to be the main production floor, pointing out rusted conveyor belts and the skeletal remains of assembly stations. Massive pillars rose into darkness where the overhead lights had once hung. The place smelled of mildew and stale air, and the corners were blanketed in shadows. I've heard people still come here for scrap metal, Bobby said, his voice low, but I don't know if that's just a rumor. Sarah, usually the calmest in our group, kept glancing over her shoulder. Scrappers are not, she muttered. I'd rather not get caught trespassing. If someone's lurking around. We pressed on, drawn deeper into the heart of the structure. The corridors were lined with broken lockers and twisted wires dangling from the ceiling. We passed what looked like an old break room, its door ripped off the hinges and the interior walls tagged with graffiti. Most of it was unreadable scrawls, but one message stood out in large spray-painted letters: "Keep out or else." We paused there for a moment. My pulse thudded in my ears, and I felt a surge of doubt about this whole adventure. But Tristan nudged me forward, shining his light down another hallway. "Come on," he urged, "let's check out the second floor. I heard that's where they used to keep the administrative offices." A wide metal staircase led upward. The railing was rusted and wobbled when we held on to it. Step by step we ascended, our flashlights bouncing off walls covered in peeling paint. As we reached the second floor landing, the wind gusted again, rattling a loose door somewhere behind us. Every sound was magnified up here. Rows of doorless offices ran along a corridor. Papers were strewn across the floor, some so old they disintegrated under our feet. Filing cabinets had been tipped over, and in one office a chair lay on its side, next to a discolored rug. It all spoke of a rapid closure, as if people had picked up and left overnight. We moved on until we reached a large corner office. The glass in the windows was mostly intact, giving us a partial view of the Detroit River, illuminated by a faint glow from street lights outside. A battered desk sat in the corner, and Sarah rummaged through it, finding nothing but outdated brochures and bent paper clips. Suddenly, Bobby froze. He held up a hand for silence. "Do you hear that?" We all went quiet. I strained my ears and caught the faint sound of something skittering, like small footsteps on concrete. Rats, I told myself, or maybe a raccoon that found its way inside, but it didn't quite sound like typical rodent noise. It was heavier, like a person stepping carefully. Sarah hissed, "Who's there?" Into the darkness, though I wasn't Sure, she expected an answer. Tristan said. His jaw, let's check it, get out, but carefully he said, don't freak out. He led us back into the corridor, shining his flashlight around. In a slow arc we crept forward, each step feeling louder than a drum beat. The corridor opened into a cavernous space that must have been another section of the assembly line. My flashlight fell on a tall figure about 50 feet away, half hidden behind a column. Even from this distance I could see the worn jacket and the way the figure flinched at our light. I sucked in a sharp breath, my heart hammering. This wasn't an apparition or anything supernatural. This looked like a very real human being. The figure took a step backward, turned, and darted behind the column. Without thinking we followed, calling out, hey, we're not here to mess with you, we're just exploring. But by the time we made it around the pillar, the person was gone. Our flashlights revealed only concrete walls, twisted metal beams, and piles of debris. Someone was definitely in here with us, and then they likely didn't want company. We huddled together, whispering. Bobby looked more rattled than I'd ever seen him. We should get out of here, he said, voice trembling. If it's someone living in here, they might not appreciate us snooping around. Tristan nodded, glancing around wearily. We can head back the way we came, let's move fast. Sarah squeezed my arm for reassurance, and we retraced our steps. I kept my flashlight high, searching the darkness for any sign that the figure was following us. My imagination conjured scenarios of a scrapper with a crowbar, desperate to keep their territory secret, or maybe a group of people living in the recesses of the building who wouldn't be thrilled about intruders. We kept quiet as we navigated the corridors, the wind still whistling through the gaps in the walls. Occasionally I caught a faint echo of movement from somewhere in the factory, footsteps or scraping sounds that made my stomach clench. Every so often Tristan would motion for us to stop, shining his light behind us, but there was never anyone there. At last we found the side entrance we'd used earlier. When we stepped out into the night air, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The wind was cold against my face, but I'd take that any day over the oppressive stillness. Inside we squeezed back through the sag in the fence and hurried toward Tristan's Honda, hearts pounding. Once we were safe in the car, Sarah spoke first. I don't know who that was, but I'm glad they didn't try to confront us. Her voice was still shaky. Bobby nodded, turning the key in the ignition. We shouldn't have gone in there. I mean, it's trespassing, and we don't know who's living in those places. Tristan, who usually acted fearless, stared out the window. We didn't see anything supernatural, he said quietly, but it's still unsettling. You know it is, I agreed, rubbing the goosebumps on my arms. I've never been so tense in my life. As we pulled away, the headlights briefly illuminated the factory's hulking silhouette. The building looked like a fortress of rust and broken glass, the wind tearing at the gaping windows. I wondered if the person inside was watching us go, relieved we left, or maybe annoyed we ever showed up at all. That night back at my house, I lay awake, replaying the events in my mind. Part of me felt guilty, thinking maybe we'd invaded someone's makeshift home. Another part of me was simply shaken by the reality of being in a dark, deteriorating structure with a stranger lurking around corners.